January 1892. By the fourth day of the blizzard, Raven's Crossing was disappearing. The storm had simply erased it. Across the valley, roofs groaned under immense weight. Barns vanished beneath rising drifts. In town, families burned their last firewood, huddled in freezing darkness. Yet, a strange rumor drifted through the whiteout. A faint light was still burning high on the ridge. Most dismissed it. Nothing could survive up there. Not in this. Half a mile above the dying town, Gideon Mercer closed his ledger on a single handwritten line. Day 4. Cabin. Still holding steady at 65 degrees. He listened. Outside, the wind screamed against the cliffside. Inside, the stove crackled softly. His wife, Ruth, slept near the hearth, and across the floorboards, Brass lay completely still. The old cattle dog had not made a sound since the storm began. He didn't pace or watch the door. He simply rested, as if the mountain had already decided their fate. While the valley below lost its fight against winter, the cabin inside the granite alcove remained untouched. It was doing exactly what Gideon had calculated it would do. But why had he trusted a barren stone cliff when everyone else trusted the town? 7 months earlier, Raven's Crossing looked nothing like the place the storm would eventually bury. Mayor Edwin Crowley stood behind a scarred wooden desk while a survey map lay open between them. Fresh settlement parcels covered the valley floor. Good grassland, productive soil, easy access to water. Most newcomers fought over those claims. Gideon Mercer ignored every one of them. His finger moved past the creek lots, past the grazing land, past a stretch of fertile ground already drawing attention from ranchers. Then it stopped on a granite ridge overlooking the town. Crowley adjusted his spectacles and frowned. That parcel? Gideon nodded. The mayor leaned closer to the map. There's barely enough level ground for a wagon. That's not what I'm after. The room grew quiet. When Gideon explained that he intended to build a cabin inside a natural stone alcove on the mountainside, several men waiting near the wall laughed aloud. One shook his head. Another muttered something about mountain hermits. Ruth Mercer remained silent beside her husband. Crowley studied the ridge again, certain he had misunderstood. Why would anyone choose that place? Gideon reached across the map and tapped the granite formation. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Because that's the reason I want the land. For a moment, nobody knew what he meant. That only made the claim more interesting. Long before he claimed the granite ridge, Gideon Mercer earned his living moving freight through the mountains of western Montana. His crews opened wagon routes, supplied remote mining camps, and established winter storage sites where goods could survive until spring. Years spent in high country taught him lessons that maps rarely showed. Snow rarely landed evenly. Wind rarely traveled in a straight line. One ridge could strip itself bare, while another collected drifts taller than a wagon. Certain rock formations bent the air. Others broke it apart. A few created pockets of remarkable calm. Gideon called those places the quiet side of the mountain. Brass had followed those cold trails, watching Gideon study the paths of the wind and the subtle lines of old snow. Ruth was the first to hear the idea. The daughter of a stonemason, she understood rock and knew that trapped moisture, not the cold, was the true enemy of timber. When Gideon described utilizing the natural alcove to avoid fighting winter directly, she did not laugh. She asked about drainage, studied his sketch, and trusted his observations. Where others saw only a barren cliff, Gideon saw a shelter. A week after claiming the parcel, Gideon and Ruth climbed the granite ridge, carrying little more than a notebook, a measuring chain, and a lunch pail. The stone alcove looked unimpressive from a distance. Up close, it told a different story. The opening faced southeast. Morning sunlight reached deep into the recess. Above it, a massive granite overhang projected several feet beyond the face of the cliff, creating a natural roof. The back wall consisted of solid stone. Centuries of weather had already tested it. Gideon spent most of the afternoon studying details other people would have ignored. He watched how the wind moved across the ridge. He checked old snow lines trapped in cracks. He examined patches of dry lichen growing on the rock. Each observation pointed toward the same conclusion. Winter rarely entered this space directly. Ruth knelt near the ground and brushed away loose gravel with one hand. The soil underneath was firm and dry. That mattered. Moisture ruined more frontier homes than many storms. Gideon unfolded a rough sketch and marked where the cabin would stand, not against the mouth of the alcove, farther inside, protected, sheltered. Using the mountain itself as the first wall, most settlers built houses that faced winter head-on. They spent every cold season fighting wind, drifting snow, and temperature swings. Gideon envisioned something different. The cabin would not carry the full burden. The mountain would absorb much of it first. Ruth studied the drawing for several moments before adding a suggestion of her own. "If we raise the floor on stone piers," she said, "air can move underneath." Gideon nodded. That would keep ground moisture away from the timbers. By sunset, the system already existed in their minds. Granite for mass, a sun pocket for warmth, a wind shadow for protection. The cabin itself would simply connect those advantages into a place where people could live. News traveled quickly in Raven's Crossing. By the second week, people were making special trips to the ridge just to see the strange project for themselves. One afternoon, Silas Voss, the wealthiest cattle rancher in the county, rode up on a polished bay gelding and studied the granite alcove from the saddle. A grin slowly spread across his face. "I've got a cattle barn worth $4,000, he said. "With the money you're putting into this place, you could build 2 real houses." Several men laughed. Silas swept an arm toward the cliff. "Instead, you're moving into a hole in a mountain." Gideon continued marking foundation lines with a measuring rod. The reaction only encouraged the crowd. Before long, new nicknames began circulating through town. Some called him Mountain Mole. Others preferred Stone Hermit. The most popular was Mountain Fool. Gideon heard every one of them. The granite ridge offered no opinion. Not everyone arrived looking for entertainment. A few came because they genuinely believed the project would fail. Among them was Elias Hart, the most respected builder in Raven's Crossing. He spent nearly an hour walking through the alcove before speaking. "Stone holds moisture," he said at last. "Moisture destroys timber. Give this place a few winters, and you'll be replacing half the frame." His concerns continued. Air circulation, snow accumulation, ice formation, even the possibility of shifting pressure from freeze-thaw cycles inside the rock. Each objection came from experience. Gideon listened carefully and answered each one. He described airflow paths, drainage channels, the elevated floor, the sheltered orientation of the alcove. Hart remained unconvinced. Before leaving, he rested a hand on one of the foundation posts. "You've built wood against stone," he said. "Eventually, the stone wins." Afterward, Gideon returned to work. The discussion stayed with him much longer than the laughter had. By late summer, the project had become part of everyday conversation. Schoolteacher Clara Whitlock mentioned it during a lesson on frontier progress. To her, the cabin represented a step backward. Civilization moved toward towns, roads, and larger buildings. Living inside a mountain seemed to belong to an earlier age. Mayor Edwin Crowley voiced a different concern. He warned that unusual construction could create safety problems for future settlers. More than once, he hinted that Gideon's residency claim might face additional review if the project proved hazardous. Meanwhile, a new phrase entered local speech. Whenever someone turned a simple task into a complicated one, people called it pulling a Mercer. The joke spread faster than the facts. Only one person seemed more interested in observing than judging. Abigail Reed, the town's postmistress, listened quietly whenever the subject came up. She never joined the laughter. She simply remembered what everyone said. On some evenings, that made Gideon feel more alone than open ridicule ever could. Summer settled over the ridge, and the laughter from town slowly became background noise. Work filled the days. Before sunrise, Gideon often hitched Slate to a wagon and headed toward a stand of lodgepole pine nearly 10 miles away. By evening, rough-cut timbers rattled behind the horse as they climbed back toward the granite alcove. The mountain accepted nothing easily. Every board had to be hauled uphill, every tool had to be carried, every mistake cost time. Weeks passed beneath the steady rhythm of axes, saws, and hammers. The first structure to appear was the floor system. Stone piers lifted the cabin above the ground exactly as Ruth had suggested. Heavy beams followed. Then came the frame itself, rising piece by piece against the granite backdrop. Visitors often arrived just in time to witness the hardest part of the work. They saw Gideon guiding roof beams into place. They saw Ruth balancing on temporary planks while fastening wall boards. Most never stayed long enough to see the next stage. A second interior wall gradually appeared behind the first. The gap between them was carefully packed with raw sheep's wool purchased from a nearby flock owner. Each handful disappeared into the cavity until the walls became thick enough to trap warmth and slow winter drafts. Near the rear of the alcove, another project took shape. Gideon carved a small food cellar into a softer section of earth sheltered by the surrounding stone. Shelves followed. Vent openings came next. Nothing looked impressive on its own. Together, the pieces formed a system. Brass spent much of the summer moving between work areas, usually settling wherever shade happened to be available. Sometimes the old dog watched from beneath the wagon. Other times he followed Ruth from task to task as though inspecting the progress himself. Sunday visitors became a regular occurrence. Families rode out after church. Children pointed. Men offered opinions. Women exchanged doubtful glances. Yet each week revealed something new. A floor, a wall, a roof, then windows, and the outline of a real cabin stood inside the mountain. The jokes continued. So did the work. For Gideon and Ruth, that was enough. Autumn arrived quietly. At first, everything seemed to be working exactly as Gideon had planned. The cabin stayed warm through chilly nights. The small stove used less wood than expected. Drafts were nearly impossible to find. Even the temperature inside the food cellar remained steady. For several weeks, the mountain appeared to be keeping its promise. Then one cold morning changed that. Gideon was checking the north wall when he noticed a thin line of moisture hidden behind an interior board. The droplets were small, easy to ignore. He did not ignore them. 2 days later, the temperature dropped again. The moisture became frost. A pale ribbon of ice stretched across the wood. Ruth ran her fingers lightly over the frozen surface. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The cabin suddenly felt less secure. If moisture continued collecting inside the wall, winter would eventually rot the timbers from within. The insulation would suffer. The structure itself could weaken over time. Finally, Ruth looked toward him. "Can you fix it before winter?" Gideon did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed the board and examined the cavity behind it. The problem became clear. Warm interior air was reaching a cold pocket where circulation slowed too much. The design worked well almost everywhere, but one section of the wall trapped moisture instead of moving it away. For the next several days, part of the cabin came apart. New ventilation channels were added. Air paths were redirected. Several pieces of insulation were repositioned. The work felt frustrating because success had seemed so close. When the repairs were finished, Gideon waded through another cold spell. This time, no frost appeared. The mountain had delivered its first test. Winter had not arrived yet, but the lesson was already clear. A good idea still had to survive reality. The repairs held. By late autumn, the cabin was finally complete. Most settlers measured success by how a house looked from the road. Gideon preferred numbers. A small thermometer hung beside the door. A notebook rested on a shelf near the stove. Each morning and evening, he recorded the same details. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wind conditions, firewood consumed. The entries accumulated week after week. patterns emerged. Even during the first hard freezes, the cabin required far less fuel than comparable homes in Ravens Crossing. By Gideon's calculations, wood consumption was running roughly 65% lower than the town average. Few people cared. One exception occasionally stopped by. Abigail Reed would glance through the ledger while collecting mail deliveries for the ridge. She never offered an opinion. She simply compared numbers from one visit to the next. The figures remained remarkably consistent. Meanwhile, winter continued gathering strength beyond the valley. One evening, Gideon closed his ledger and looked toward the distant ridges. The first page of evidence was complete, and the recorded figures were highly promising. Yet he understood that calculations on paper were only a preparation. The true test from nature was still ahead. Late January of 1892 brought changes that most people never noticed. Gideon noticed all of them. Brass had become restless during the previous week. The old dog spent more time watching the western ridges than sleeping near the stove. Flocks of crows abandoned the valley earlier than usual. Snow that normally gathered along several western slopes appeared in scattered patches instead. Even the wind seemed uncertain. One day, it came from the northwest. The next day, it shifted south. Then, it changed again. Nothing by itself meant much. Together, they reminded Gideon of winters he had witnessed while surveying mountain routes years earlier. One morning, he climbed to a rocky overlook above the cabin. The Bitterroot Range stretched across the horizon. A low band of lead-gray clouds crawled slowly along the distant peaks. Back inside, he opened his ledger and checked the barometer. The pressure had fallen sharply. An hour later, Slate carried him down to Ravens Crossing. Silas Voss listened for less than a minute before chuckling. "A storm?" he said. "It's Montana. That's called January." Elias Hart heard him out but remained unconvinced. Every winter produced warnings. Most amounted to nothing. Mayor Crowley reacted differently. The mayor suspected Gideon enjoyed the attention. "People already think you're trying to prove a point," he said. "This isn't helping." By afternoon, the warnings had gone nowhere. Only Abigail Reed paused long enough to ask one question. "When did you first notice the signs?" After hearing the answer, she quietly wrote the date on a scrap of paper and slipped it into her ledger. The town returned to its routine. The mountains did not. Gideon did not return to town after that. There was nothing left to argue about. The next 2 days passed in steady preparation. Extra firewood disappeared into neat stacks along the cabin walls. Water barrels were topped off and moved farther from the entrance. Every hinge on the outer door received fresh oil. Feed was carried to the animal shelter. Crates of potatoes, carrots, and dried beans were transferred into the storage cellar. The work never felt hurried. It felt deliberate. Ruth moved through the cabin with a checklist in her head, inspecting each detail as carefully as Gideon had inspected the mountain months earlier. A loose latch was tightened. A draft near a window frame was sealed. Several blankets were relocated closer to the stove. Meanwhile, Brass spent most of his time near the alcove entrance. Every so often, the old dog wandered outside, stared toward the valley, and returned without making a sound. Snow began falling shortly before sunset. Large flakes drifted through the still air. Ruth paused beside the doorway and watched them accumulate on the granite ledges. "Do you think it will be that bad?" For several seconds, Gideon said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the darkening sky beyond the ridge. Then he answered quietly, "It doesn't matter what I think." A gust of wind rolled across the mountainside. The mountain already knows. After that, they returned to work. The storm was coming whether anyone believed it or not, and then it came in the night. No second warning came with it. No pause. No gradual build. 1 hour. Snow drifted quietly across the ridge. The next, a white wall slammed into the valley and erased everything beyond it. Wind accelerated towards 60 miles per hour, then higher. Snow no longer fell from the sky. It raced sideways through the darkness. Temperatures plunged below 38 degrees below zero. Every exposed surface surrendered to ice. On the first day, Snow quickly swallowed the roads, began burying fences, and hemmed in all of Raven's Crossing. Windows cracked beneath the pressure of the cold. Barns groaned whenever a strong gust struck their walls. Chimneys collected ice faster than families could clear it away. Across the ridge, the mountain seemed almost indifferent. The cabin inside the granite alcove remained remarkably stable. Each morning, Gideon checked the thermometer hanging near the door. The reading barely moved. The stove consumed wood at the same measured pace recorded in his ledger before the storm arrived. Warm air circulated through the cabin exactly as intended. The repaired wall remained dry. In the shelter beyond the cabin, Slate stood calmly chewing hay. Nearby animals settled into the routine of eating and resting. Throughout that afternoon, Brass simply lay asleep beside the stove. That troubled Gideon in an unexpected way. The dog behaved as though nothing unusual was happening. Outside, an entire valley fought for survival. Inside, the mountain absorbed the violence before it ever reached them. The wind screamed across the ridges day and night. Deep within the alcove, the granite answered with silence. That silence became harder to ignore with every passing hour, because the mountain was not resisting the storm. It was simply enduring it. By the second day, the storm stopped feeling like weather. It felt like pressure. Relentless pressure. Snow driven by powerful winds piled against buildings faster than people could remove it. Every drift created another obstacle. Every obstacle trapped more snow. At Silas Voss's ranch, white walls rose higher with each passing hour. What began as a nuisance became a threat. Drifts climbed past windows, then past the lower edge of the roof. One livestock barn carried the weight as long as it could. The collapse came suddenly. A sharp crack, a violent groan, then silence beneath tons of snow. Across town, Elias Hart faced a different problem. Ice formed inside part of his ventilation system. Airflow slowed. Smoke that should have escaped through the chimney began lingering indoors. By the end of the third day, maintaining heat required constant attention. Other families faced similar struggles. Woodpiles shrank. Doors disappeared behind packed drifts. Men spent precious energy tunneling through snow just to reach sheds and fuel stacks. Each hour demanded another task, another repair, another attempt to stay ahead of the storm. The buildings that had seemed perfectly suited to frontier life were now fighting battles they had never been designed to win. Meanwhile, a very different record was taking shape above the valley. Inside the granite alcove, Gideon continued making entries in his ledger. Date, temperature, wind conditions, fuel consumption. The routine never changed. Late on the third evening, he wrote another line beneath the previous entries. Day 3. Cabin, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The pencil paused briefly before moving again. Outside, the storm kept burying Raven's Crossing. Inside, the numbers remained almost unchanged. For the first time, proof existed. The mountain had begun delivering its verdict. Late in the afternoon on the fourth day, a dull sound echoed through the granite alcove. A knock. Then another. Brass was on his feet before anyone else reacted. The old dog stood motionless for a second, ears forward, staring toward the outer door. Gideon grabbed a lantern and crossed the sheltered space between the cabin and the entrance. The wind forced its way inside the moment he opened the door. Snow swirled through the gap. Two figures stumbled forward. Elias Hart collapsed to one knee. Beside him stood his teenage son, barely able to remain upright. Ice covered their coats. Frost clung to their eyebrows. Their faces carried the pale color of men who had spent too long in deadly cold. It took several minutes before the full story emerged. The chimney had iced over. The fire had failed. They had spent hours digging a path through drifts piled against the house. After escaping, they followed fence lines and landmarks they could barely see through the storm. Eventually, instinct brought them toward the mountain, toward the place Hart had once criticized. The builder who had argued about moisture, airflow, and stone pressure looked nothing like the confident man who had walked the alcove months earlier. At that moment, he was simply a father trying to keep his child alive. Ruth wrapped both men in blankets. Hot water went onto the stove. Steam slowly rose from 2 tin cups resting on the table. Nobody mentioned past arguments. Nobody spoke about predictions. The storm continued roaring beyond the granite walls, while warmth gradually returned to frozen hands. For a long time, only the crackling stove filled the room. Then Hart lowered his eyes toward the cup he was holding. His voice sounded rough, almost embarrassed. "You were right." The words hung in the air. Gideon did not answer immediately. Instead, he added another piece of wood to the fire and glanced toward the door. The storm was still out there, and somehow he suspected Hart would not be the last visitor before it ended. The storm continued through the night. By then, people in Ravens Crossing understood a hard truth. Surviving inside their own homes was no longer guaranteed. Word traveled in fragments. A neighbor reached another house. A family spotted movement through blowing snow. Someone remembered the cabin hidden inside the mountain. The route was dangerous, but it existed. Fence lines became guides. Rock outcrops became landmarks. The wooden markers Gideon had placed months earlier suddenly mattered more than anyone had imagined. Throughout the 5th day, figures emerged from the white chaos one after another. Mayor Edwin Crowley arrived exhausted and covered in ice. Clara Whitlock appeared later with several frightened children and 2 elderly residents. Families followed. Then more families. Every arrival carried the same expression: relief mixed with disbelief. The granite alcove gradually transformed into something far larger than a cabin site. It became a refuge. By late afternoon, 31 people occupied the shelter. The cabin itself remained the warm center of activity, while the protected stone chamber around it provided additional space for sleeping, cooking, and storing supplies. Ruth organized food with quiet efficiency. Meals became smaller, but everyone received something warm. Abigail Reed sat near the lantern light with a notebook on her lap, carefully recording the names of those who had made it to safety. Gideon divided firewood according to need rather than status. The mayor received no special treatment. Neither did the wealthiest rancher. Outside, the storm treated everyone equally. Inside, the same rule applied. Brass wandered among the gathered families, as though he had accepted responsibility for them. Children scratched behind his ears. For the first time in days, a few even smiled. The jokes that had once followed Gideon across town had vanished. Nobody mentioned Mountain Mole. Nobody mentioned Stone Hermit. Nobody mentioned Mountain Fool. The place that had been mocked all summer now held nearly 1/10 of Ravens Crossing alive beneath the mountain. Beyond the entrance, the wind still screamed across the valley. Inside, firelight flickered against granite walls, while 31 people waited together for morning. Morning arrived without wind. That was the first sign the storm had finally ended. For several moments, nobody moved. The silence felt unfamiliar after 5 days of constant noise. Then Gideon opened the outer door and stepped into a world that barely resembled Ravens Crossing. Snow covered everything. Fences had vanished. Roads no longer existed. Entire sections of the valley appeared smooth and featureless beneath enormous drifts. Several rooftops barely remained visible. Others had disappeared completely. The damage became clearer as more people emerged from the shelter. Collapsed barns, buried sheds, frozen livestock trapped where the storm had caught them. Search parties formed almost immediately. Men grabbed shovels and ropes. Small groups spread across the valley looking for survivors and assessing damage. Each hour revealed more of the disaster. Nature had spent 5 days testing every structure, every decision, and every assumption the town had made about winter. Some things endured. Many did not. Above the valley, the granite alcove remained almost unchanged. 31 people stood alive because they had reached it in time. The difference was impossible to ignore. Months earlier, the mountain cabin had been treated as a curiosity. Now it stood as evidence. The verdict had already been delivered. The storm was gone. Its judgment remained. Several days passed before people found the words they wanted to say. Silas Voss arrived first. The rancher removed his hat before speaking, something few residents of Ravens Crossing had ever seen him do. His storm losses had been severe. Part of his herd was gone. One of his largest barns existed only as broken timber buried beneath snow. "I judged that place wrong," he admitted. Others followed. Mayor Crowley came next, then Clara Whitlock, then Elias Hart. The conversations differed in detail, but they all traveled toward the same conclusion. What they had mocked had worked. What they had trusted had often failed. Yet the most important moment came from neither apology nor praise. It came from a notebook. One evening, Abigail Reed sat at a table inside the cabin with Gideon's ledger open before her. Several townspeople gathered nearby as she slowly turned the pages. The entries stretched back for months. Temperatures, wind observations, barometric pressure, firewood consumption, dates, conditions, measurements. Every page told the same story. The cabin had remained stable while weather conditions changed around it. Fuel use stayed dramatically lower than most homes in town. Even during the blizzard, the recorded temperatures barely shifted. Nobody interrupted. Arguments had little room to survive beside numbers collected over an entire season. Abigail closed the ledger and rested her hand on the cover. For the first time, the discussion moved beyond opinion. Evidence now occupied the center of the table. Across the room, Elias Hart studied the walls in thoughtful silence. Eventually, he looked toward Gideon. "Would you mind if I measured everything?" There was no challenge in his voice. No skepticism. Only curiosity. He wanted dimensions, ventilation paths, floor height, wall spacing, the principles themselves. Months earlier, Hart had come to explain why the cabin would fail. Now he hoped to understand why it had succeeded. A year later, Ravens Crossing looked different. The changes were subtle at first. New homes appeared along sheltered slopes instead of exposed flats. Storage cellars were dug deeper. Windbreak walls became more common. Builders paid closer attention to ridges, drainage, and snow patterns before choosing where to place a structure. Nobody copied Gideon Mercer's cabin exactly. Most people couldn't. The granite alcove on the mountainside was unique. What spread across the valley were the principles behind it. People began studying wind before they studied floor plans. They paid attention to terrain. They learned that location could be as important as lumber. Elias Hart played a large role in that change. The builder who once predicted failure became one of the strongest advocates for practical winter design. He incorporated protected entrances, improved ventilation paths, and better site selection into projects throughout the region. Mayor Edwin Crowley made changes as well. New winter building guidelines encouraged settlers to consider prevailing winds, snow drifting, and natural shelter when establishing claims. The lessons of the blizzard slowly became part of local knowledge. Years passed. Children grew into adults. New storms came and went. The mountain remained. Gideon spent the rest of his life in the cabin he had built beneath the granite overhang. Ruth remained there beside him through the passing seasons. Visitors still climbed the ridge from time to time, usually to ask questions or study details that had once been ridiculed. Brass stayed with them for many years. When the old dog finally died, he was buried on the slope facing the alcove entrance. The spot overlooked the valley he had watched through countless winters. Eventually, Gideon's own life came to a quiet end inside the same cabin. Ruth lived several years longer. Afterward, the community raised a modest bronze plaque near the entrance to the granite shelter. The inscription avoided grand titles. It did not describe a genius. It did not celebrate a hero. The words were simpler than that. He listened where others argued. The mountain answered. Time continued moving forward. Snow returned every winter. Wind still crossed the ridges. The valley changed. The mountain barely did. Even decades later, visitors stepping into the granite alcove noticed something remarkable. Outside conditions shifted constantly. Inside, the temperature remained steady in a way that felt almost timeless, much as it had on the day Gideon first stood there with a notebook in his hand, studying the stone and wondering why the wind seemed to lose interest in that particular place. The answer had never belonged to him. It had been waiting in the mountain all along. He simply took the time to listen,